we have Griet, Vankeerberghen, Associate Professor at the Department of History and Classical Studies of McGill University, and Raja Sengupta, Associate Professor in the Department of Geography and McGill School of Environment. And they will be presenting, representing the mobility of historical agents through digitization and topographic pathfinding, the diary of Shirao.
Teaching has been over for a while, so I'm forgetting where I need to click all the buttons. So thank you so much for coming to this this session. So this really, I mean, I've been able to listen to some of the earlier presentations. Ours is really not a, I mean, it didn't start as a digital humanities project. It really started as a, you know, because we were interested in, we had historical questions we wanted to solve. I'm a historian of the early imperial period in China, the Western Han Dynasty mostly, and we wanted to look at mobility and investigate how mobility of various groups, nobles, but also officials, merchants, soldiers, throughout the realm really kind of created empire to some extent. And of course, if you want to look at mobility for the modern period, there are a lot of tools available from geography. We use them every day when we, you know, try to find our way across our cities, etc. But we run into problems when we try to apply those methods to historical data. First of all, I mean, what we want to be able to represent, so we don't capture just one moment, but we have, you know, we're looking at a period of 2 centuries, and hopefully will extend to even more centuries. So you have to be able to visualize how things change over time. And then there is also the problem that our data can be very sketchy and have all kinds of problems, right? So sometimes we know that someone existed, but we don't know the person's name, or we don't know the exact place. We know he traveled somewhere, but we cannot locate that place, etc. So we run into many problems of that sort. What we decided to do is to get our feet wet by looking at one person's travel. So it's really a micro history that we're starting to do. And we looked at the travels, the travels recorded in a diary, and the person who kept this diary was named Shirao. He died at the very end of Western Han in 10 BCE, and he was so he worked in Tunghai. Tunghai is here in eastern China. So this is the Shantung Peninsula. This is eastern China. So it's in this area, and he worked there as a low-level official. So our goal is to visualize where and how Shirao traveled, and to do this based on the landscape as it existed in late Western Han. So not only, you know, administrative boundaries change, but also the landscape has changed quite drastically since Western Han. So who was Shirao? So we know about Shirao not from the transmitted text, because there is no mention of him at all, but we know of him because his tomb was discovered in 1993 at Yinwan in Jiangsu province. So here, so this is the coffin of Shirao. This is the coffin of his wife, and here we have a foot compartment with all kinds of grave goods. Now, it's easy to see that Shirao was a scribe. He had all kinds of implements like these writing brushes within his tomb, and then significantly also a lot of texts. And from those texts, we can deduce quite a bit about Shirao's life. Now, one of these texts was what we call a diary. It's difficult to pinpoint the exact nature of the text, but we say it's a diary, and the diary covers exactly 1 year, a year that corresponds more or less to the year 11 BCE, so the year before he passed away. In terms of, if we look at Shirau's diary, it's written on bamboo slips, and originally we now have about 70 partial slips, but originally it would have been 62 slips, and this was kind of a pre-formatted calendar in which entries were written. So these are the first bamboo slips in the reconstructed. So it gives you the months in which he traveled. On top here, we get an indication of the days, and then we get more indication of each days, and then some entries have actually a bit of text that gives us information about what Shirau was doing on a particular calendar day during this year. So the kind of information that is provided by the diary is very often where he spent the night. And as a low-level official, he traveled quite a bit, so he could be. I mean, many times he's at home. He also slept in his dormitory, in the place where he worked. So he didn't commute every day, but would sleep in his dormitory. Or when he traveled, he spend the night in various official hostels and accommodations. So that's that's mostly the kind of data that we used for our projects. But we also get information about visits he paid, about the rent he had to pay, about the weather, about when he got ill, etc., etc. And I have here, the entries are very short. I just give 2 examples here. So at sunset, on March 15th in 11 BCE, I arrived at the governor's compound. That's where he worked. And I immediately presented myself to the governor. Then I spent the night at the dormitory. Or, for example, on March 29th, he spent the night at the relay hostel in Pangcheng. At dawn, it was raining. I fell ill. So that's the nature of this diary. In terms of so the kind of the limits, the geographical and temporal limits. So in terms of time, so it covers 1 year in the Chinese kind of the Yuan Yin in the year of a Chinese emperor, and it translates into Western time from February 14th, 11 BCE to February 2nd in 10 BCE. And what's interesting for our purpose is that it includes travel in all 4 seasons. So sometimes he traveled in winter, sometimes he traveled in summer, which would have made things a little bit differently. He made a total of 22 trips during that year. And some of those trips were within his home commandery, and others were to either neighboring commanderies or to kingdoms. He went to Chu Kingdom, to Langye Commandery in the north, and then also to Chenyang Kingdom, which was also in the north. And so here all the red dots that you see here are all places where Shirau traveled in the course of that 1 year. And so this is where his home was, and this is where his office was located. And so this is Chu Commandery, Chenyang Kingdom, and then here Langye Commandery, where he also traveled to. The base map here is, as indicated here, it's Tang Qixiang's historical atlas. And this is a landscape that has been transformed pretty dramatically since Western Han times. So the current coastline, it's not very well visible, would be somewhere around here. And so the map has expanded quite dramatically. And also the direction of many of the rivers has shifted over time, especially, and this has to do with the Yellow River that was pretty erratic and caused big geographical changes to this area over time. So I've already explained the first point. What's also interesting about this kind of these travels that Schirrau undertook is that he traveled in a human landscape that was really, had a very, very long history. First of all, it was a very fertile agricultural area, so a lot of wheat and other plants, but it also has a very, very long history of settlements way before Shang Zhou, so way before the imperial period. And it also had a very, very well developed road network. And we read in the transmitted sources in the history, occasionally it's clear that kind of big dynastic events impacted this area as well. If we look at this slide, this is about the first emperor. It's the first emperor of the previous dynasty, the Qin dynasty. And he, Shiji, our main historical source for the Western Han, gives information about the first emperor's travels. So it says the first emperor then went south to ascend Mount Langye, and I indicated the places here in blue. So this is Schirrau also went to Langye, right? And then it says he returned by way of Pengcheng, but it doesn't exactly indicate how, kind of which roads he took. We have a similar problem with Schirrau that he tells us, I stayed here, I stayed there, but he very rarely or never tells us exactly how he went. And then interestingly, to get to the second problem we're trying to figure out, so then it says, I proceeded southwest across the Huai River here to Huangshan and Nanjun province, which is here. And then floating down the river, I reached the shrine at Xiangshan. So the river he must be floating down. Here is what we now call the Yangtze River. So he floated down the river, as the text says, or floated on the river. And that's interesting, right? So we were also interested in trying to figure out possible modes of transportation. And so that he traveled by boat is certainly also a possibility, even though we don't know whether this happened in this area. So to transpose this into questions, how would Schirrau have traveled? So which modes of transportation did he use for his various trips? Did he use different modes of transportation when he went south or north or whatever? And then also, how are the various landscapes related to the activities that are mentioned in Schirrau's diary? And so we decided, because I mentioned 22 trips, it would be, and actually we looked at all 22, but for the purpose of today's presentation, we'll focus on 2 of these trips. And one is a trip southwest to Pengcheng. Pengcheng is nowadays, it corresponds to Suzhou. Suzhou in Jiangsu province, and it was back then the capital of Chu kingdom. So Schirrau went outside of his home commandery, crossed that boundary, and went to Chu. Actually, in the beginning of this year, Schirrau went to Chu repeatedly. And then the second trip we will focus on was in a northerly direction to Dongwu in Langye commandery, which is exactly where the first emperor also spent quite a lot of time. And this is a winter trip, so from December 3rd to January 10th. The whole trip ended pretty dramatically. because we read in his diary that the commandery governor passed away, so he had to rush back home to kind of attend to funerary arrangements, etc. I'm now going to hand over the floor to my colleague Raja Sengupta, who will kind of discuss the geographical approach to all of these questions. Raja.
Thank you, Griet. Thank you, Griet. So just to take over from this perspective, when we look at geographical methods, we can, for example, look at the terrain, or we can, if you remember, Griet talking about both the roads connecting different areas or the river journeys, right? So we use two different methodological approaches. One referred to as the least cost path analysis, and the other referred to as agent-based models, to look at how these journeys might have, how we can reenact or re-simulate these journeys. Next slide, Reed. So at first,
sorry,
next slide.
I'm sorry, my screen seems to be frozen. Okay.
So the first of these is the least cost path analysis. And the simplest way to think about it, and this is a standard feature of most GIS software, is that if you have a terrain and usually represented at what we call as a digital elevation model, you can think of trying to hike from the orange arrow to the blue arrow. And as you hike up, you're most likely to follow a path of least resistance. That means trying to avoid climbing very steep hills as you go up. And you are going to try to go as much as possible along a path that doesn't take you along the steepest slopes, of course, right? So and that can be done using a digital elevation model, and that's what's most likely to happen if you were to put in a road between connecting two cities. You really want, when you use elevation, you don't want to go along the steepest slopes. You actually want to go along paths that are relatively low slope. Next slide. Next. So the other thing is, however, it gets a little more complicated when you want to know how to simulate travel along a river network. In that case, what we can do is we can use something known as an agent-based model, which is comes from complex systems theory, but it's a very simple method of rule-based travel. So for example, as you can see, if you look on the right-hand side, this is a model developed in NetLogo with very simple rules for the what we call as an agent. So if the agent is going from the orange dot to the green dot along the river, what the agent would do is to say that I'm going to face the river so that I get to the river as quickly as I can, and then traverse that river up till I reach that green dot, right? So what it does, it creates a path that would prefer the river in most options, right? So it actually travels to the river and travels along the river as much as possible. And then we can start to compare what the distances would look like between the least cost path, which is a topographic or elevation based path, and the river path. So Reed, if you go to the next slide. So here is the first journey, which is an overland journey to Pangchang from his home and dormitory, going through Wuyan. So we know that he, on March 4th, he departed at dawn, and he spent the night at the Wuyan guest house. And then on 5th, he traveled for Wuyan. But the unfortunate thing is we're missing 2 entries. And all we know is that he reaches on the 8th to the relay hostel in Pangchang. However, what we can do is we can then calculate topographically what those, if you're trying to avoid the steep slopes, you can start to look at the distances covered between these different places. So for example, from dormitory to Wuyuan, right, he covers 61.5 kilometers or 147.6 li, which we'll come to in a second. Now, if you next slide, Reed. If we were to simulate the same distance using an agent-based model, which tends to follow river networks, you will see that the distance the agent actually tries to go along the river as much as possible, and at times jumping between river networks, especially between Dormitory and Wuyuan. You can see the river really is flowing north-south, not really east-west, and therefore the agent is jumping river networks. This is important to remember for comparing distances. Next slide, please, Read. We can repeat this for his trip to Dongwu. And as you can see, the least cost path analysis again has found the distances between the places he says he visits on that trip. So for example, on December 30th, and this is a winter trip, by the way, so it's a slightly different time of the year. He's starting from home, from his dormitory, going to his house, home, and then to the Lee guest house in Lee County before proceeding to Linyi and Gaoguang and Dongwu. Right? So you can see the distances that he covers, about 70 kilometers a day. So this is the topographic distance. We can repeat the same thing with the agent-based model. And in this case, you will see perhaps it's a little more sensible, although there is still jumping of river networks, right? And you can see as he goes from the dormitory to Lee County to Linyi, he is following the river as much as possible. Of course, because they're not on the same river branch, he has to jump between river branches. So what is this? What can we say about the modes of transport and the travel speeds? So what was actually reported in the literature. So as Reed pointed out, Reed, can we keep to the previous slide? You could go by foot, by cart, horse, or boat, right? And we have some actual speeds which are in the next slide. And as you can see, for example, if you were on foot, you went a minimum, and a day is considered about 12 hours. You could go 30 li or 12.5 kilometers minimum in a day to a maximum of 41.6 kilometers on foot, right? Actually, we'll see there's a variation on boat as well, 40 li or 16 kilometers to 66 kilometers. However, horse travel was also well known, and you can see you could go up to 166 to 208 kilometers per day. So when we start to compare these different travel distances, next slide, Read. You will see that, for example, when he's going between different locations, the distances can be significantly different. And by the way, the bars that you see, the colored bars, are underlying the numbers, are showing you the fraction of the journey. So for example, if you see the journey from Wuyuan to Pengchang, right, which is this Wuyuan to Pengchang, the straight line distance, if you were just to go straight between the two places, is 61.3 kilometers. If you take the topography into consideration, obviously it's going to be a little longer, and it's 75.9 kilometers. But that is still about half as much as the distances if you take the river, which is 120.4 kilometers. So the green bar that's underlying the 75.9 is showing you what fraction of the maximum distance is the distance traveled if you just took the topographic distance. Now, this is important because the reason why this is important is because it shows you that almost all the times the river distances were much higher. Next slide. Right, and so now here we are comparing the distances, and what we think and we feel is that in several of these journeys, it would have been more likely that he took a direct line, the least cost path that followed topography, rather than jumping between river networks. Next slide, please. And the same thing goes for the second trip. Now for this, the picture is a bit clearer because this is a winter trip, right? He definitely passed through different river branches, so it's not likely that he was jumping from river branch to river branch to make this journey. It was winter, the area is mountainous, it's not likely that the rivers were navigable, so it is highly likely that the path that he took was one of following the topography. And considering the large distances that he covered, 77 kilometers or more, it is most likely that several of these journeys were made on good roads on horseback. And so in conclusion, last slide, I'd like to just say that this gives us some interesting ways to understanding history and in the context of through the geographical lens, right, through the placement of features and their location on the different landscapes. And Reed and I personally believe that this is a new and emerging application of geospatial technologies to understanding history. Thank you. And of course, we have some acknowledgements here, our students and the funding agencies, which include SHIRK and our collaboration with the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. Thank you. We are open for questions now.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Professor Vankeerberghen and Professor Sengupta. Now questions are open for this presentation. So if you have any questions, please just click the reactions icon at the bottom of Zoom to raise your hand or type your question in the chat so that I will read questions for you.
Yes, I have a question, if I may. I'm just curious if you tried, since I know you've been working on this for some time, with any other information, and I'm thinking about text or passages when sometimes we don't have all this detail that we have as in the case of this manuscript, but we just know that one day they're here and the other day or a few other days after they are in another city. I was curious if you tried as an experiment to figure out if you can remap that movement.
Reed, go ahead.
Yeah. So we haven't actually tried because we're still, but we are expanding. So we kind of digitizing those rivers, kind of making, kind of creating the administrative boundaries, and we're doing. So we're not trying to. I mean, we were lucky in the sense that Shurao lived in late Western Han, which is about the time, I mean, the administrative divisions are almost the same as they were during, for the time that Tan Qixiang kind of put them in his atlas, so we can use those digitizations. But then we're also trying to capture all the changes over time. And that's a huge work of kind of going to the sources and trying to find out what changed and how things changed. So we're doing that. And then we're also digitizing the river networks because, as I explained, they changed quite a bit compared to today, whereas the mountains are roughly still in the same place. This is not the case for the rivers. But the idea is to indeed expand the project and then, expand it not only kind of in geographical reach, but also in temporal reach, so that we can actually, investigate. Suppose Shurao had gone to the capital, which he might have done, we're not quite sure, kind of how would he have traveled to get to the capital. But also, all those other groups, nobles, emperors, all these people who we know traveled. Think of the kind of all the people, all the soldiers who went when Wu Ti conquered the Northwest, right? There wasn't. I mean, it really happened by putting soldiers on the road and sending them very far away with supply lines, etc. So we're hoping to be able to capture these things in the future.
Yeah, and thank you for doing all this work that becomes available to us too. In that terms, if I may, do you think it will be possible at some point? When there's movement of people and therefore there is textual production in a new area, geographical area, and we are not always able to date it. Do you think it may be possible, or is it a bit too much of a stretch if we can map when people got there, possibly when also the texts were produced?
I can sort of answer that. I think it is possible. I think one of the things, what's fascinating about this technology, especially looking at technology to tell us, is that we can, run the simulations with many possibilities, right? So we could, Shurao is a very detailed case, and partly we picked Shurao because it is so easy to what we call calibrate our models. We run the model, we see what the distances are, and we can then tie that back. But the really fascinating thing would be if another group, say a nobles, took the journey and it took them much longer, or took or the dispersal of hominids. To think, the wildest possible, like how did the hominids disperse across the plains of I mean, just all sorts of possibilities are possible. It's just the precision gets less, of course, but then you can use this as an exploratory tool to say when people got to where they were going or where we expect them to go, um, just by changing some parameters, right?
Yeah, thank you.
Helena?
Yes, thank you. I have another question. You mentioned directions that are mentioned in the diaries. So from my experience with working with Defunctory much later, the directions that are indicated in the text do not always match with the directions that you see on modern maps. So does this give you an idea of how the landscape was imagined by the historical actors? And is there a way with GIS to represent like historical perceptions of landscapes?
Reka, you want to go ahead? Yeah.
No, go ahead, Griet. I'll answer after.
Yeah, so I mean, he doesn't really talk about direction. So when I said he traveled northeast, it's based on, I mean, that's my vocabulary. So it's not Shurao's vocabulary. And what he means, so he does talk about home, jia is the term. And then there are all these, administrative centers, and there are hostels. So he basically, his trip goes from hostel to hostel, and these are all government spaces. And then there is one possible exception. There is a relatively low mountain which is close to his home, Yushan, where he possibly might have gone for entertainment, right? So these are, I mean, in the spatial imagination, these are very different spaces, right? The place where you kind of fulfill your job, kind of do your work, your home, entertainment, etc. So we can see some, but by and large, it's really kind of what he did in his function as an official for the government.
Okay, thank you for answering all these questions.
Yeah, I'm not sure it answers your question because it's a great question, but yeah, we have limits in what we know about this person.